Just 1 second, I'm waiting. Google Hangout to go, and all right, now it seems to actually know what's going on. So I'm going to start off a quick introduction about myself. Hopefully I don't get too much feedback throughout this night. My name is Pete Clody. I am a front-end developer at Packback Books. It does not like my computer. Is this better? Yeah. Hey. Okay. So, as I said, I am a front-end developer at Packback Books. We are an electronic textbook rental company. Our big thing is pay-per-use, and that's right? Pay per use. Thanks, Carl. And so, if you are a college student, know a college student, like textbooks yourselves, check out our site. Maybe we can help you save some money on it. Okay. So the first thing we're worried about is, obviously the reason you're here is Angular. Most of you know about it. Show of hands, how many of you actually program in Angular at the moment? Not a big number. So I'm guessing the rest of you are probably jQuery, Backbone, possibly some Ember folks, all 8 of you. And Knockout, I'm guessing, is out there, and I'm sure there's a few others I'm missing. But as we all know, the reason we're here is Angular is a big deal. It's a big deal because it's Google. If it was anybody besides Google, would it probably be as big of a deal? Hard to say, but it is what it is, so that's why we're here. But it definitely isn't the only thing, but that's what we're worrying about. Oh. Forgot how to use my own presentation. Okay, so the other reason we're here is, as I'm sure most of you who are interested in Angular have tried, reading a presentation or a tutorial, it helps to some degree. There's usually something they do that they're considering to be a fairly rudimentary or normal thing, and it just completely blows up the whole learning curve. An example I ran into today when I was trying to find a screencasting application, it was a guy talking about doing an AngularJS tutorial connecting to Firebase, and I think there's one other thing thrown in. Well, all of a sudden that introduces the complexity of not only are you trying to learn Angular, which you probably don't know, hence the reason you're looking for it, and now you have to learn Firebase. It just adds complexity, and it makes it difficult to try to figure things out. So tutorials, they have a lot of value, but they're not always perfect. And one thing that anybody of the few of you who have dealt with Angular know, Angular is easy until it is not. And by that I mean that to get up and running with a very rudimentary site that really doesn't do much of anything, but at least it looks pretty, and you have two-way data binding, and you have some forms and so on. As soon as you want to start connecting that to the real world, things can get kind of difficult. All of a sudden you start caring about its topic of dependency injection. You have these services that come into play. You're dealing, how do I do AJAX calls? I just want to pull simple stuff. It gets a little weird fairly quickly, and a lot of it, I think, is terminology. And we're also here because 42. It's the answer to everything. There we go. All right, so we're going to start off by talking about what an Angular application really is. An Angular application is just a collection of various pieces that all fit together, providing different usages and functionality to the overall system that helps pull it all together. So the first thing we have is the actual application object, or module, as they like to call it. And what this is just your parent item. And what you do is you end up connecting everything else into this module. You can then have things that are connected into this module and give them to other people, and they can easily take your module, bring it into their system, and everything can be up and running. Can you still hear me in the back fine? Okay. The next thing that any of you who have maybe looked at Angular and saw it and go, what the hell are they talking about, is dependency injection. It's a weird name. It means exactly what it says, actually, but it's kind of a weird name that'll throw you off and go, well, what are they talking about? Why can't they call it something else more, that's much more accessible and simple? All dependency injection is just allowing the system to know everything you have and give it to you when you want it. It's effectively what it does. Then we have routing. Routing is what routing is. Everybody who's ever written any kind of web app, they have some form of routing. The routing could just be simple linking between pages using anchor tags, or if you're getting into in a single page app framework, then you can start getting into different routing and just how it's going to chain all the different pages together based on different parameters. Then it has a concept of a controller. A controller is basically the code behind a page. That's really what it comes down to. They do various things for the page and other things, but that's really what they are meant to be. You have templates or your HTML. Any of you who have tried to look at Angular before, you're going to recognize that Angular HTML looks really, really jacked up. And the reason is because they have these other things that I'll get to, I think, maybe the very next item, called directives, and that's how all the real work gets done on the templating side. Oh, wasn't the next one? It was services. Services are really where the rubber hits the road. These are the actual business logic pieces of your application, and you end up writing a ton of these. They all tie together, and then you build up your app out of it. Then you have a thing called a provider. A provider is just a way to pre-configure a service before the application starts. That's all it is. You tend to use pre-built ones. I've not encountered too many times where you really need to build your own. All right. Okay, so now we're going to get into the actual module. The concept that Angular likes to use, and I'm sure it's used other places, I know I've heard it many times, is bootstrapping. Essentially, that just means pulling the application all together, configuring it, starting it up, making sure all the services are running, everything that it needs, everything that the Angular system needs to get running is there. So you have two different forms. You have auto bootstrapping and manual. Auto is by far the most common way to do this, and the main reason is that just means you have one app in your single page app. Seems simple. The way you do this is you just take, if you'll see here, trying to do this on one screen against another, you'll see this ng app equal demo app, and that just means that that's going to tie that app into that level of element. It says any. Typically, it could be your HTML tag, it could be your body tag, but it could be something even lower if you wanted to. That's up to you. But that's just how you can connect it up there. Or if you are doing something that even the Angular team thinks is a bit unusual, you can manually bootstrap your app. What that means is that you can go in and you can have a particular Angular app that is actually technically 3, 4, 5, 10, 15, 200,000 different apps. I personally don't know why you would do this. I'm sure there are applications and reasons you would. I haven't seen anything, but like anything, it exists out in the world somewhere. So the basic way that you end up defining this module or this application, as I mentioned before, is you're just actually going to use a very simple call in your JavaScript file, angular.module. That's all it is. It's a very simple base level Angular function. You provided a name for your application. Now, this is the name that you're going to be using every time you reference this module throughout the rest of your code. And then if you see, I have here some square braces and ellipses. The square braces, they come into play at one time and one time only. And that one time is when you're actually bootstrapping your application. And what they do is you will pass in all the names of all the other modules that you're including into your application so that Angular can then pull all that information out and everything's just available when you need it. And dependency injection, the grand greatness of Angular, works beautifully. Okay, so within a module, you typically, you have the module function itself that we just saw. And then you will chain off of those a config and a run function. A config function is exactly what the name implies. It allows you to actually configure this application. So in here, you're going to set up routing. You're going to set up maybe if you want your, because as any of you have probably encountered, typical single page apps, they're going to have the little hash bang in the address. If you want it, they have a, Angular will call it HTML5 mode that allows you to get rid of that hash bang, make it look more like a real address. Does a few other things and beyond that. But this is where you actually tell it to do things. So this is all, your application is starting, but it's not running. So you're in that little early section of things. So that's where this config comes in. So as I said, where all the setup is done. The main thing to realize here is when you're in this config setup, there's a few things you can't do. Actually, there's one major thing you can't do. You can't use services. I'll get into exactly what a service is, but suffice it to say, as I mentioned earlier, a service is the actual business logic, the real workhorse of your application, but you're not running yet, so you can't use it. They're purely, execution time modules. So at this point, you can't use them. But what you can use is the provider, which is basically a way to tell the service how it will run once it does start up. So it's like you can configure certain things, and I'll show you an example right after this that actually, well, let's just get into it. So a little bit of code, because everybody loves code. Hopefully, if you're in the back, you can maybe read it. I tried to make it as big as I could. The presentation is on GitHub. You'll be able to see it later. Hopefully the screencast comes out well. So, bear with us for now. You'll always be able to go back to it and play around with this wonderful, wonderful presentation, because I know you're going to be so excited to go over it again. So what this is basically doing, this is a straightforward configuration that's just setting up a router. This is actually the router configuration I have for the demo app that I created for this presentation. So what we have, we'll talk about, so at the very top here we have, find my mouse. We have the square braces that I mentioned. And then in there we have some strings. And we have strings that are saying ng resource, ng route, ng sanitize. Anything that starts with ng is something that Angular itself is providing. And these are different modules that do different things specifically from the Angular team. Resource we'll get into later. Route is effectively their routing piece. They actually pulled their routing piece out, so that way if you don't like their routing, which a lot of people don't, it's a very simplistic router, but it can do some stuff for you. But you want to pull in maybe a third-party router. This gives you complete and utter control to do so. So a nicety there. ng sanitize is something that's just there to help keep the code clean, help with compiling templates and doing different kind of low-level stuff. So now we come into the actual config function, and we see that square brace again. Well, we had the square brace before up in the module, and that was telling us these are all the different things that I'm pulling in to help build this application. Well, what am I doing? What does it mean here when I'm actually in this config function? Well, as part of the config function, or any function here on out, that square bracing is how you do dependency injection. So that big, lofty idea of dependency injection. And there's a couple things that you can do, and it's the trickiest thing that as a new Angular developer, you have to, I like to say you should never do it. And I'm very anal retentive and obsessive about it, so I'm able to make sure I don't do it. But right where the string $route provider, you don't have to put that there. You can just have $function and then route provider, and Angular will figure everything out. It's able to tell by the name that you give it in the parameter list, is this something I know about? And if it is, it builds it. If it's not, it blows up. The reason the string is there beforehand, and that could be numerous strings, and we'll see in later examples that it can be, that string is there to make sure that when you minify your code, Angular knows what you're wanting. Because the problem comes down that when you minify it, the route provider in the function call, as we all know, that could turn into anything. could turn into A, B, C, D, whatever the minifier decides to make it. But since these are all, the dependency injection is very positional, having $route provider as a string before that function call lets Angular know, even with minified code, oh, okay, that very first parameter that is now called B is a $route provider. So that's how it basically keeps minification from completely blowing up your code. As I said, you don't have to put this in here, and your application will run perfectly fine until you minify it. There are tools out there that will fill this in for you later if that's how you want to roll. As I said, I'm kind of obsessive and anal about it, so I do it manually. So we've gone over the dependency injection on here. Now we have the issue of, let me find my mouse again. We have this route provider, and we're calling these when functions on it. So the route provider, as you can probably assume, is how you actually set up your routing, and at least the basic routing that Angular provides. And the when effectively is telling you when the address is /, when the address is /user /, and then we'll get into that variable, or when it is / single page. So if it sees any of those when it's running, right now we're telling it, this is what I want you to do when you see that address. So if we go to this when /, the template URL is saying, this is the actual template file. This is the HTML file that has all the Angular goodness baked into it that I want you to use when this particular route is being set up. And then you have a controller line. And then you're saying, well, this is the controller that goes with that HTML, and that controller, as I said earlier, is the actual code behind, is the power behind the throne, if you will. It's the code that makes the template actually work. And then you have the other ones down the line. And at the very bottom, we see otherwise. Otherwise is your fallback. So basically, if someone comes into your app, and right now we've defined / user / single page, and they come in and they say, okay, well, how about / Pete? Well, this app has absolutely no routing for Pete. So what it will fall through, you can think of it as like a select statement, select or switch, I don't know. Can't remember which language I program in anymore. So, and so the otherwise just says, okay, anything I don't know about, I'm now going to just redirect. If I don't know what it is, you're going to the home page. That's all that's doing. And you could give it any valid route in that redirect, or you could give it an invalid route and blow up your entire app. That's completely up to you, and do what you like to do. So that is effectively how, what the configuration is doing. It's setting things up before the application runs. And by and large, you're always going to be doing a route provider in here, or if you use a third-party router, you'll use theirs and you'll do it in here. But maybe a couple other things, but by and large, you don't do too much in here unless you're getting into a pretty impressive application. So now we're getting into the actual startup of the application, the run function. And this is where everything's starting to spool up. This is where your services are available. Not all of your directives and your controllers are available, but your services are available, your values are available, your constants are available. And values and constants are they're basically Angular wrappers for exactly what they are. Angular wrapper for an object, or an Angular wrapper for a read-only object or value, whatever you want it to be. So in the run function, according to Angular, you actually could use a provider. They really, really recommend you don't. Because at this point, you're running your application, everything's starting up. Any configuration that you're going to do at this point should have been done in config, because this is the very next step after that. So while technically it will allow it, it is not recommended by any stretch of the imagination. So you can use services, values, constants, filters. Pretty much, that's the main crux of what you can do there. And then we'll show a run function. Run functions, they're as intricate as you want them to be. This is really a stupid example that does absolutely nothing useful. So this basically says that when I start my application, I want it to immediately reroute to user /5, 5 being the ID, which actually, I mentioned here this colon ID. I don't think this is a terribly inventive notion that only the people at Google conceived of. It's used other places. Effectively, that's just saying this is a variable field. But it's called ID so that when you want to reference it somewhere else, you know what it's called. But that's just meaning that's a variable field. And you could have any number of variable fields, and it's actually possible to even have optional fields if you want. It just depends on how complex you want to make your routing. All right. So basically, this is very much earlier. We have our dependency injection. This time it's $location. If you remember back to the previous one, that was provider. Providers always have the word provider at the end. It's just a naming convention that they really recommend, and it makes everything very easy to understand what's going on. But everything else, all the services, everything else, those are not just going to be some name. $sign is from Angular. You're very much encouraged to never name anything yourself, $, whatever. It'll just cause confusion. Potentially, you could run into a name collision. Who's to say, right now, maybe you don't, but version 1.4 comes out and all of a sudden you do. Or maybe version 1.5 comes out and you run into problems. It's going to happen, so just stay away from anything named $. All right, so we're going back to dependency injection. As I said, it's magic. It is, rabbits coming out of hats. It is flowers appearing out of sleeves. It is birds disappearing into thin air. Or it's a mapping and caching mechanism that is as straightforward as anything you're ever going to write, which is what it truly is. It is nothing fancy. It is nothing exceptional. It just makes things seem kind of weird. And I've encountered many developers who I'm working with who just are very uneasy with dependency injection. They're like, how does it know what I want and when to give it to me? It's a very quality idea and a good concern. A lot of what we're using, since we're using a framework, you use any framework, there's trust. You trust that the Angular team is building this dependency injector correctly and that they're not going to give you something wrong at some weird point. But effectively, it's just caching. It's, they map it out, they cache it, they know what it's called, they can find it later, they can build it if it needs to be built. So another aspect of dependency injection is that as we mentioned earlier, with those different modules and the other things, you have to let Angular know what's available. It's, it's a one-year-old child or maybe even a half-day-old chimp. It knows nothing about anything. So you have to go in and you have to tell it, when you're defining something, you have to tell it what module it's based off of. So what you do is you come in and you redeclare your module, and you don't, luckily when you're redeclaring it, you don't have to put the square braces and then all those modules you want later. You're just telling it, hey, remember this module? And it uses dependency injection to go find it. It's kind of crazy. It goes and finds it, and then says, okay, you know what? I'm now going to register this particular thing against it. And that way I'll be able to find it later. And the different things, you have factories, services, controllers, values, constants, filters. Yeah, there's a few. There's a handful of different things. And basically that just lets the Angular system know what's available. So when you're actually injecting, so when you're making that, if you remember back to that run call where we had $location. So when the application sees that, it goes off and it looks in its cache and says, do I already have one of these? Is this something I have and I can give them? And what it is may be a fully formed object. What it is may be a factory function that's going to create that object. It could be any number of different things. But it looks to see, do I already have this available? If it does, it gives it to you. If not, it creates it and gives it to you. Yep. All right. So this is a nice little screenshot that is impossible to read from probably more than like 3 rows back. But that's okay because I stole it from the Angular tutorial website. So feel free, go on there. It is, what is it? Step 5 for the current stable build of the Angular tutorial. And effectively, it's doing what I just said. It does a quick search. It says, okay, do I already have one of these? And if so, go ahead. Here you go. If not, let me create it. And then here you go. Let's roll on. So it seems a little daunting and a little scary at first. And you're kind of looking, it's like, how does it know what to do? Why is it giving me the things? How do I know it's giving me the right thing? Myself and many other people who have worked on Angular for quite a while can tell you, don't get too worried about it. It works. I've yet to see the dependency injector blow up on me. It hasn't bitten me in the ass. But that's going to happen tomorrow, I'm sure of it, because I just said it here. But tomorrow's another day, and it'll be fine. All right. So we'll go back to routing. I went over it quite extensively already, I feel. So let's just come back to it. It's telling your app where to go. You say, hey, here's a particular address off of my base, either a domain or a domain, and it just knows, okay, you want to go there? All right, this is what I need to do to make the Angular app be here. So that's all that is. This mouse froze. It's very slow here. It also as we pointed out with the template URL, it tells the system what should it display. So you have this great HTML that has all this wonderful HTML and it has style, and then it has all this other Angular goodness baked into it. So it tells it that's what you want to see there. And then it also tells you how to make that function. So here's kind of an interesting thing. Even though it is a single page application and it has all this other JavaScripty stuff going on around it, you don't need to actually give it a control. You don't need to give a controller for a particular route. You can just come in there and say, okay, for this route, for /Pete, I wanted to only show an HTML file. That's completely fine, completely acceptable. You can do that all day, every day, and Angular will be happy with you. And I think I actually do that. I think that dependency injection picture slide actually was that exact thing. But if you want to do anything interesting, you want to react to things, you want to take a mouse click, a button click, and turn that into an AJAX call, you want to have values changed based on other things, or pulling things in and updating and doing all this two-way data binding, that's where you need your controller. That's where you need your JavaScript code. It also does other stuff. There's a lot of weird little extra properties that you can do in the baked-in Angular router. I've used a couple of the more interesting ones where you can I use some of them for authentication, making sure that a page is authenticated before you get to it. You can also make sure that that the controller is getting a proper grouping of data, so you can make sure all these other objects are set up. They're available. If you're building a basic app, you're probably not going to run into it, but there are things, you'll see the documentation. There's quite a bit more it can do. We're just not worried about it, and typically you're just going to set up templates and controllers.
So is that either a template or a controller?
No.
You should repeat the question.
Yeah. Oh, okay. So the question was, is the template and controller an either or? And the answer is no. You can have both a template and a controller. You can have a template. I can't believe that you would be able to just have a controller. So I can't think of how that would actually play out. Yeah, I can't think of an example. Maybe you can, maybe someone can find a way. Personally, I don't know of one, but yeah, so it's template and controller, template, no controller, and that's pretty much what you got. All right, where am I at? Man, this mouse is slow. All right, so we'll go back to this again. We have the different different ways to set up your routing. And these are basically the same examples I showed earlier. I won't go into them too in depth once again. You have your way where you configure it. You tell the router that this is how everything's going to work. When you go to this address, this is what I want you to do when you go to this address. And then at the bottom, you use the location service and you say, go to this URL. And it does everything it needs to do. It navigates to it. It reloads everything. It sets up whatever it basically gets Angular rolling to that route. Hopefully that route exists. So not too much more than we've already talked about. All right, so now we're getting into the controller. So as I've said, this is the actual code of the page. Get rid of that. So the controller itself, it runs the actual page. It does what the page wants it to do based on button clicks and other things. In here, you can interact with all of those different interesting things I mentioned that Angular has. It has a service, so it can interact with all your business logic. It can interact with values and constants, which are essentially just ways to kind of get around the idea that you don't really have true classes and objects. It just kind of gives you that. And then you also have filters, which are just ways of manipulating data in a very structured way. You can interact with those in your JavaScript. But then a very important thing it does is it allows interaction or information to be passed to and from the template. And anybody who's ever used any other single page application framework, an Ember or a Backbone or Knockout, whatever, you're familiar with the concept of two-way data binding. The way Angular handles this two-way data binding is by having things come back and forth on a scope object. That's a specific object that Angular has created, and they'll, typically every controller you make is going to have a scope object injected into it. And you can set up variables, you can set up functions, you can set up all kinds of things on this scope object, and that will allow you to then access that data or in the actual template itself. Here's a quick bit of controller code, which once again, I apologize to people in the back, and pretty much I'm guessing anyone probably south of the guy in the Phillies hat. This is effectively just loading up, it's going to load up some data. It's going to set up a few function calls that are going to interact with that data. But because they're actually on the scope object, the template will actually be able to use them. It will be able to run through that user's data. It will be able to call the load user function, the cancel function, update user, delete user functions. And so then it will be able to do real work because of the access through the scope object. Then you have the actual template. It's HTML. We've all used HTML in some form or fashion. So anything from there is going to translate over. But it's not really pure HTML. It carries over the standard syntax of all your different elements and so on. But then it adds in all these Angular specific things. The one word you're going to hear thrown around with that are directives. Most people, when they encounter directives, specifically when they have to try to write a directive, they get pretty freaked out. They're a little bit weird. They take a little bit to get used to. So I'm not going to be covering them here today. But suffice it to say, Angular has a ton of pre-built directives. And all a directive is just, generally they just get used as an attribute. So if you're comfortable using attributes, that's effectively what you're going to be using here. This particular one I have an example of is called ngIf. All it's really doing is based on this data bound value, this visibility flag, it's going to be set just toggling display none, display or display none on this particular element. It gives you a way to just hide and show. They also do have an ng show and an ng hide. That's more for your visibility as opposed to your display. But that's how you can build out your application and get the template to start doing more interesting things and really reacting to the data that you're providing it. And then you also have Angular expressions. The syntax is pretty much exactly the same as a mustache if you're used to handlebars. So really, that's pretty much the standard of it. You tell it, here's the item, you wrap it in the double curly braces, and it then translates it out and figures out what is the actual value of that. And then as you roll through, we'll update it when that data gets updated. And of these expressions is that you can actually do some mildly complex stuff in them. So you can actually embed a little bit of work in there. You can, probably a more useful thing, I mean, their example is always, you can put in 2 + 1 because that's something anybody in the world has ever done. But one of the things I've been using recently that's come very handy is you can actually put in a ternary if statement into your expression. So you can actually have it sitting in there. It's like, okay, I have a particular flag that's going to then trigger me showing either this particular text in a button or this particular text. And instead of having to write a bunch of complex JavaScript that's trying to do all that, passing it back and forth and making sure everything's set up, or even having two separate button elements that are then toggled on and off using that ngIf that I showed previously, you just put it in there and you have your one little expression that anybody who's familiar writing JavaScript or any of the languages that are similar, your C++, C#, Java, and so on, you're going to look and they go, oh, I know exactly what's going on, and it keeps everything nice and simple and clean, which is not something that most people say about Angular's templating. So here is a code example. Once again, anybody, I'm thinking this may not even make it back to the Phillies guy, that it is a bunch of different, stuff. You got all your standard HTML. I'll, briefly explain that you have headers, you have an unordered list, you have a list element, and the list element has anchor tags in it. But you have a particular thing in the list element that allows you to take that user's value, that user's collection we had earlier, and cycle over it. So you just are sitting, all I had to do is write li and then ng repeat once, and it will go through and it will build and it will just make this whole entire collection of list items for me. I don't have to sit there and write out 10 or 15 and hope that I have the right number. That user's collection could have 0 elements in it. It could have 20 elements in it. I don't care. It's just building it. So get that way. But as you can see, it can also get kind of ugly. So you do have to be cautious when you're building your Angular templates to make them be as powerful as you need, but don't try to do everything in the world in there, because it will just become unusable, and then it potentially could get into performance issues because this does have to be compiled by the system. It does have to be processed every time a piece of data updates. It's not, Angular 1X is not as nearly as performant as React and what Angular 2.0 is planning on being. So, also realize you could end up bogging yourself down if you go too nuts. Here we go. Look, real actual stuff. Yeah, isn't it pretty? So really what we have here is, this is the actual culmination of those previous things I was showing with the controller and the template. And, so this is basically a more built out version of that template I just showed you. And then we have a collection of users. Was just, I had to write li, ng repeat, and then, a little syntactic stuff for the ng repeat, and it built up an entire listing of LIs for me. I didn't have to sit there and go, oh, do I have 4 of them now? Do I have 5? It just did it. So, and then the other opportunity is that when I click on this particular thing, the patient 0, it's triggering a function call in my controller code. And so I'm not, doing that and going off to a server and pulling back new things or whatever, or any kind of craziness. It just, all it does is it goes, okay, I know what this object is. Go ahead and populate it into this form. And it's all nice and data bound. So I can come in, and this is a little small for me, but I'll try what I can. Change it from p0 at test.com to p.com. And now I have a few options. I have my cancel button, I have my update button, I have my delete button. Well, Angular is also smart enough to be able to tack into your submit functionality for this form. So I've set up my update button as my submit. So if I'm on any field and I hit enter, boom. Now I'm actually kind of shocked it worked. Oh no, this one's going to work. Later on, it may blow up because I'm using a really, really bad library behind it. But it kind of worked for what I needed. So now we'll see that that's been updated. Now it's p0 at example.com, and everything's happy and everything's great. So that allows us to do that data binding, to have those different things pulled together. I can come in and I can delete that particular item. Unfortunately, I didn't write this well enough so that I do have to click on each one to delete them. And as I said, this is all very slow because I'm looking at a much smaller version of this screen than you are. right. And now, because it realized that it has none of those entries, it can give me a particular status message that makes sense to the user to let them know that, hey, there's no users, there's nothing here I can display, so I didn't have to do anything fancy with that ng repeat logic. It knows there's nothing there, so I'm not going to do anything. I just had to write code that would handle the fact that there's nothing there, so now show this message instead. And unfortunately, I flipped by it already, but there's an interesting factoid I learned when I was building those users that I was wanting to use the city of Springfield in various states, and ended up on Springfield, South Dakota. And I discovered on Wikipedia that Springfield, South Dakota has a population, I think it was like 1,900 and some odd people. Of that population of 1,900 and some odd people, it's like 1,400 or 1,500 of them are in the prison. So go visit beautiful Springfield, South Dakota. All right. So now we're getting to services. As I've been saying, the real workhorse of the application. This is where your business logic is going to happen. This is where you're generally going to build all your AJAX code, or at least your reusable AJAX code. You can build your AJAX code in your controller if you wanted. You can build it anywhere you want, but the most appropriate place is in the service. Typically, services are singletons. They don't have to be, but by and large, they tend to be. And that's also one of the things that makes dependency injection so easy, because you have this object, this service, it gets created once, it's now sitting in a cache, you've done whatever you've done to it. When you want it again in some other controller, some other service, some other whatever, it's just there and it can pull it out and move on. But as I said, it doesn't have to be. You could create a service that is something you actually instantiate. Contains the business logic. We've gone over that 18 or 19 different times. Yes, more code samples. Hopefully you can read maybe 2 lines of this. Man, that looks small up there. So effectively what it is just, it's returning an object. It's a function. Now, actually, for those of you with really good eyes, you'll be able to see at the very top, I'm calling it a service, but the actual thing is a factory. There is actually a function in Angular called service, and there's one that's called factory. A service effectively just wraps a factory call, and it's kind of weird how they set it up. Generally, you always just use factory, and you call it a service, and you move on. Occasionally, you might need to worry about a service actually generating a service itself. I rarely ever do. It ends up causing an extra step. That's usually like when you do have to instantiate it, then you'll use it. But otherwise, just always use a factory. And so what that will do is, and then you just return whatever your particular service is, and it's going to be an object. And so I'm returning an actual object itself. And then inside of there, I have various things. I have a bunch of functions, and I have a user collection. So all of this one is doing is it's essentially a caching mechanism for user objects. So that's all this is, not exciting code. And as I mentioned earlier, the provider is just a way to pre-configure the service. The one I showed you doesn't have a provider. You don't need to create providers for all your services. Typically, you don't ever need to create a provider. But sometimes you will, and it's generally something where you are going to set it up that based on a few different configurations, that's going to determine what your service is. So you could set it, have like a precondition that you set up that says, I want this to be a service, this baked goods service to be birthday cake as opposed to pie. Horrible example, just came up with it. You get what you pay for. Oh, didn't want that. So the providers should always be named the same as whatever the service it's providing is, and then you just tack the name provider at the end. It's a naming convention. It works. It keeps everything simple. Everybody seems to be okay with it and move on. And as I said, it gives a way to pre-configure this particular service. So as the example, baked good service or baked good service, the provider allows you to say pie, birthday cake, and then when you want the service, that's what you get is either a pie or a birthday cake based on how you configured it. All right. Here's some code for a provider. I'm basically using the route provider because I couldn't think of a good example for provider, and why not use this? And effectively, as I said, it's just giving you a way to actually pre-configure this particular thing. All right. More live code, or at least real stuff. So once again, we're going back to the user's idea because I'm not that inventive. And this what we're going to do here is we're just going to create a user. And because it's a horrible application, you're actually going to tell it what the ID is. But there we go. Oh, this guy's connected to stuff I didn't want him connected to. All right, well, needless to say, somehow this guy got connected to bad stuff. But what it'll do down the bottom is it will give, it's going to show that we're adding the user to this user collection service, and this user collection service is then, going to return everything that it has in it, and so we can use it later. Unfortunately, this is hooking to an API that I was going to demo later, and stupid things happened. And it completely blew up some other code. All right, so we'll move on from there. Now, probably one of the major things that you're going to use over and over again, and really is what helps make these single-page front-end applications worth actually paying people like us to build, is that they can make AJAX calls. We can connect to a server, the servers that's actually doing the real work, number crunching, all the fun, all the crazy stuff, where we just do fun, pretty pictures. So they have, right now, Angular has two different ways you can do this. You have the $HTTP and the $resource services. The $HTTP is a very low-level thing. It basically, it gives you an ability to make a call on a particular URL, give it a few parameters if you want, pass in some data, and then it returns a deferred object or a promise that allows you to then handle that asynchronous response. And the asynchronous response is coming back through the success or the error handler. The service itself, the HTTP service itself, it's going to give you a few different built-in functions. Like get, function, post, put, delete, head, patch, JSON, P. So the general things that you're used to seeing on any RESTful verbiage list. It will give you those functions. That way you don't have to set it up and say, oh, I want to configure it and the method is put or the method is get. There's, save you, that extra little bit of code. And guess what we got next? Oh, where's it going to be? Code samples! Yay! Yeah, come on, they're exciting. So this one, once again, you can't read it, and I apologize, but you try the best you can. This is effectively just doing a get call. Right now it has the method get in there. If you see that little property, completely superfluous, doesn't mean anything. I'm already saying this is the function get. Why tell it get second time? But this is also giving me a transform response, which allows me to then massage the data on the way out so that when whoever is calling this gets the data, it's already in a new fancy fun format. So, pretty low level. If you've ever used jQuery's AJAX services or functionality, same thing. Nothing to, just a slightly different wrapper around it that makes it more Angular-y. All right, now we have the resource, which is effectively the same. It wraps that HTTP service, but it gives you things. It's more geared towards RESTful APIs. So it still gives you a get function that works exactly the same as a normal HTTP get, except it's going to return you a resource object. That resource object itself is going to have a few different functions on it itself. It's going to have a $save, a $delete, and a $remove. Those seem a little weird. You're like, well, why does it have a $sign on it? Because those are the built-in ones that then allow you to just, if you can update a particular piece of data in that object, call save, it then does a post for you and sends in all that new data. You don't have to try to write any kind of other code for it. It just knows. It knows, here's the properties I have. I'm now going to generate that post request. Same with remove and delete. Remove and delete are just the same thing, but they decided to implement both. Basically, you should only use it if you're actually using a RESTful API. Otherwise, it's just extra overhead, and it's not going to give you anything, and probably will get in your way a little bit. It does require the inclusion of an extra library. They kept it separate because not everybody needs it. So, if you don't need it, don't use it. If you do need it, that's how you can access it. And once again, code sample. I'll blow through this one. Basically, it's very simple. It's basically one line. You just you create a service, you return a resource object, you tell it what the URL is, if it has any parameters that you're passing in, any variable parameters. And for whatever reason, the Angular team decided that they don't want to implement a put handler. They implement two separate delete handlers, but they don't want a put handler. So generally, most people are going to just set one up yourself. You just call it update. You say the method is put, and then you can call update later, and it knows to say, okay, this is a put request, and it knows what to do. So nice and simple. All right, scroll back down. Here's the code that actually should have been hitting that node server. So this is effectively this is pulling data off of a node server using those different requests. Here we can see that it's actually making calls to the get function. It's handling the success. Get a little click on there. It's handling the success, which is an accomplishment of an aim or purpose, according to Google Dictionary. So we got that going for us. And basically, that just means everything worked. And now, since everything worked, do what you want and react accordingly. It also has an error handler. Then you have your other ways of doing updates, where an update, for whatever reason, isn't actually on the object. You have to call it off the class. They get a little funky with there. I'm not super happy with how they implemented that, but that's what it does. Here we see some more two-way data binding and all the updates and other fun stuff. We're getting near the end. So, you can stop trying to read my stupid examples that you can't see anyway. So here's a couple tools that I have found very, very useful in my life as an Angular developer. They work for other tools, so you don't have to say, oh, if I'm not an Angular developer, I can never use these. But as an Angular guy, this is what works. You got Yeoman. Anybody here ever used Yeoman before? All right, very, very few. Effectively, what Yeoman does for you is you give it very basic params. So it's a node application. You download it through npm, and you're able to run it, and it scaffolds up an entire application. So you can pull down different generators, as they call them, and say, I want a generator. They have one built in that's an Angular generator that also uses Grunt and Bower, and it just builds all the boilerplate for you. You tell it a few things, and it saves you the hassle of having to build all of this rudimentary, annoying code that you build 18 different times in your life, and then you have to configure a Grunt file, and then you have to set up Karma, and then it does it all for you. So it's a pretty cool tool. I definitely recommend checking it out. Maybe it'll be useful for you, maybe it won't, but it's worth looking at. Then we got NPM. I'm sure everybody probably has heard of NPM at some point. Node Package Manager. Also, terribly useful tool. You can actually use Angular. Angular is now available through NPM, but there's still a lot of the Angular extras that other people have written that are not, so you're kind of not really able to completely rely on that. Then you get Bower, which was created by our friends at Twitter. It's another package manager, and it really gears towards any front-end pieces. So, if you've used it before or not, if you need a slider control, which actually I have a slider control that I wrote that's out there in the world, that's on Bower. If you need a clock, you need a button that does something fancy, whatever it is, I'm sure, it's probably out there somewhere, and there's probably like 10 versions of it, because that's just how this open source stuff works. Then you have Grunt. If any of you have ever used a task runner, chances are you've used Grunt. Maybe you've used Gulp. But basically, this just gives you a nice, clean way of setting up all the really annoying stuff you have to do. How do you run your tests? How do you build your deployed code? How do you copy all this stuff around? How do you, one of the really nice things I like about Grunt is it has this live reload feature. So it will run your code, it'll put all your code together, compile any SAS or less code you have, and then it will spool up a node server and then run your app off of that node server. And every time you change any file, a template file, a JS file, even an image, whatever, it will then update that to wherever it's holding all that data and refresh your browser for you. It's called Live Reload. It's awesome. Gulp kind of maybe has it if you install a Chrome extension and you sacrifice a chicken, but only a chicken to Baal. If you sacrifice a chicken to Bahomet, not going to work. So keep that in mind. Gulp. Basically, Gulp is just a new, fancier version of Grunt. They are doing the same exact thing. Gulp is just, people call it better. It's supposed to be faster. It's using all streams and all the fancy new node stuff. I found it a bit confusing, and I'm not trying to become a professional Gulp person. I'm just trying to be a professional Angular person. So I gave up after enough hassle. So worthwhile tools. Angular 2. We went through how to actually build a straight up Angular 1 application, and most of you are sitting here because you actually have a concern about doing that. But in the back of your mind, or your friends, whenever you talk about Angular 1 or anybody else you encounter, they're always going to say, oh, but Angular 2 is going to come out. It's going to blow up everything. You won't be able to do anything. Everything's going to go to hell. It'll be awful. All our computers will crash. It'll be Y2K all over again, but this time it will be because of Google. Not so much. I'm not going to claim to know everything there is about Angular 2 merely because, as I state, it's still an alpha. It's alpha 20, I think, as of today. I'm personally not really going to dive into it until it at least gets to a beta or release candidate. At this point, alpha, who the hell knows what they're going to change? Who knows what they're going to backport? I don't know. I'm not trusting it. I got enough things to worry about without trying to learn a product that's an alpha. But the things I do know and I can tell you about, it's being built to take advantage of ES6. Right now, the Angular that we know and love, or you're gonna know and maybe eventually love, but probably hate for a long damn time, was built a long time ago. It was started up in like 2009. Things were very different. IE was a predominant browser. I think everybody and their mother was using XP or a MacBook, and it just, the world was extremely different, and the web was very, very different. Fast forward, 6 years now, give or take. I don't remember when in 2009 it came out. Everything is just advancing, and you can actually really write honest-to-God applications on the front end. You can do things in a browser that you couldn't even conceive of doing back in 2009. So they're revamping everything, and it's going to do that. The disadvantage is they're revamping everything. So they're building it upon the new components model that, taking advantage of the classes and other things that are inherent in ES6 or ECMAScript 6. But it is going to be backward compatible. This is something that I saw in one of the keynotes from NGConf that is terribly important. Is approximately with 1.4 and 1.5, they're planning on 1.5, and 1.6 may happen, who's to say, that you're going to be able to interbuild your Angular 2 and your Angular 1. It's not an either or proposition. So you can come in and you can take your Angular 1 app and all of a sudden go, oh, well, here's a nice way I can start introducing Angular 2. It's separated out enough. It's not going to hurt anything. And you pull it in. It will work. And you can do that over time. And they actually show a nice roadmap of, you can do that and eventually completely overhaul your app into 2. But you don't have to. That's the other thing that, a lot of part of the FUD that I've heard about it. People are like, oh, Angular 2 is going to come out, and then all of a sudden Angular 1s are going to not exist. It's like, well, no, Angular 1 is still going to exist. And anyone who doesn't believe that, go use a Windows XP box, because I'm sure you probably have 2 or 3 in your office. Once again, won't blow up your world. But if you do want to find out more about it, they have a new address for it. It's angular.io. I think they stopped calling it AngularJS. Now it's just Angular. So, go check it out. You can download it. It's, see what you think, see if you like it, see if you don't care. It's, that's the beauty of it. A few additional sites. I'll just blow through these if I can actually click somewhere and get rid of that. These are just some websites I use on a regular basis that are fairly useful. Do I have a third one or another one? Obviously, AngularJS.org, that's the Angular website. You can get all your documentation and everything right from the horse's mouth. Stack Overflow, as I'm sure you all know, amazing site. Year of Moo is a very interesting site, and it's not purely because the guy has an extremely interesting collection of clip art that he uses. It's kind of Japanimation, but it's like pigs wearing cow outfits or cows wearing pig outfits. It's really kind of crazy. He actually apparently, I just saw one of his presentation. He's doing the NG Animate module for 1.4. He just got hired up by Google. So, you know, he's apparently a very bright and intelligent man who we should all read his website and respect. Egghead.io. When I first started really learning Angular, which, truth be told, I started learning Angular slightly over a year ago. And that site helped me immeasurably. It's a bunch of short little videos, generally screen caps. They tend to be 2 to 3 minutes. You'll find a few 5 or 6 minutes. After a video hits a certain age, they put it out for free. Up until then, you have to pay for it. Most of your Angular stuff, your Angular 1X, is free just because it's old enough. But, you know, definitely give it a check. I'm a big fan of it, and, you know, I should take that for a look. NG Nuggets, which is an interesting site. It's a collection of little things, gives you little blurbs about different pieces of Angular. The horrible explanation I tried to give you about a factory as opposed to a service and how they are the same thing even though they're not the same thing, and you don't use one even though you call it a different thing, and blah, blah, blah. I got it from him. So, you know, you can actually get real information from him as opposed to my misremembered half ramblings. Smashing Magazine, it's kind of designy, but they're doing some really interesting front-end JavaScript stuff on there. So, you know, definitely give it a look. You know, I've had trouble keeping up with some of the articles. They do put out a lot of content, and trying to understand what they have and what they're doing on a regular basis and not lose track of it. And finally, no more code samples, no more misbehaving live examples of code and such. We're done. So any questions out there? Yes, sir. The question is, does Angular make it easy to test your code? I guess easy is a very interesting choice of words. Like any of these frameworks, they are fairly simple to test until you start getting into asynchronous behavior. As soon as the behavior becomes asynchronous, things start to go out the window, and then you have to start doing a lot of jury rigging to make sure that they all work out. By and large, Angular is actually pretty decent for it. The typical setup is you use a Karma runner, which was actually written by one of the guys on the Angular team. And then you use Jasmine, you could use Mocha, you know, whatever works for you. They're fairly simple, straightforward test runners. And, you know, the tests themselves are not that difficult. They, like any of this unit testing, they're tedious. You know, you write 10 or 15 lines of real code, and then you write, you know, a couple hundred lines of test code around it. So thanks for your question, sir. That's also my boss. Yes.
Okay, so for those of us that are new to development in general, what's your process for picking up a new technology like this?
And that was actually something I was going to bring up at the outset. I had this almost the exact same question asked of me at a Angular meetup I presented at. Unfortunately, my process is I got a job where I had to learn Angular, and so I had to. I was at a separate job where Sharp anymore, we need you to do JavaScript and Ember, so do it or find the door. So unfortunately, my process has been kind of trial by fire. But a lot of it I have found, the one things I did find during those processes, besides the resources I just showed you, find experienced developers. Find experienced developers who are actually willing to help you and talk to you. You know, because there are some who just don't, and, you know, it is what it is. The world is full of people. So, but, you know, find those resources wherever they may be, you know, be they blog posts or video tutorials online, or just someone you know who has written some code in that particular language or framework you want to use. Like, you know, that will help you immeasurably, especially, you know, just because it will just get you into it. And I find the more you have to deal with it, the better you get. Like I just started writing unit testing, I don't know, was it a couple months ago, two and a half months ago. And I look back at those first tests and I cringe. They are god awful. But you do it over and over, and I'm spending hours every week doing these tests, and you just learn it. So, a lot of it is, immersion helps. So being able to do it over and over and over and over again, but also, try to find yourself some good programming mentors. That will certainly help. Yes.
Even simpler question. So this code is pushed to the client, everything, and then just connect back to, so you can still connect to a normal database, or is this running on the server, on the back end, or on the front end?
This is actually running in your browser. So the question was, is this running on the client in the actual browser, or is this running on the server? Angular code actually is pure client side. So everything gets pulled down, and unless you're using a module system like a, what was it, Require, I think was the one I used before, and other things like that, everything gets pulled down all at once. And so you have this big download, which can be problematic depending on how your system is set up. And then everything's just running in your browser. So there's any interaction with your server is purely going to be typically an AJAX call, or if you have, or you could probably build some WebSockets in there, although they're not supported directly by Angular. You would have to use whatever your particular browser or your browser's form of it, or some other third party.
So you don't need anything else really. If you want to do web development, you can just go with Angular and nothing else, a web server, and that's all.
So the question is Angular all you need? Unlike Love, Angular is not all you need. I mean, it comes down to, you could build the world's best front end and it would be pretty and it would do all this fun stuff and so on, but it's just living on the front end. So, is that, you need a way to persist that data. And right now in the browser, we have very limited ways of doing it. If you're on a Chrome OS system, then you can probably get around it if writing a native Chrome app and so on. But, you always have to be able to store that data and make it usable by, somewhere else. So you're still going to need a server somewhere. Now, does that mean you have to write the server? Heavens no. You can try to find a server. You can have someone else write the server. You could write the server yourself. I wrote this really half-assed node server that I was running that I inadvertently hooked to when I didn't want to. So you can, but yeah, Angular, I mean, it can run in isolation, but you're going to have limited abilities to do anything interesting with it. Any other questions? Yes.
What's your file architecture look like? Are you putting like all your services in a directory, all your controllers in a directory like that, or do you organize it like based on modules, or how does that go?
So the question is, how do I personally organize my file structure? I still go with the controller, the script folder within controllers, directives, services, filters, and then break it out for views. So when I do views, I have directive views, I have partials, and then so on. I find that works for me. I've worked on a system where they did that module-based or functionality-based layout, where you had a directory that encompassed the controller for a particular module for a functionality. It had the template. It had a few directives that went along with it. It had a service that went along with it. My problem with that is I might know what something does, but I don't know who's using it. And so trying to find things became very difficult, especially how do you justify putting a service into a particular features directory? Or how do you decide that a directive should be there? The inherent notion of a service in a directive is that it's used by everybody in the system, so it doesn't make as much sense to do that. That's my feelings on it. Obviously, I'm of the opinion that you should structure it however it makes the most sense for you. An argument against my methodology is that over time, as the application gets big, it starts to get more and more difficult to really parse things out. And you have these giant folders all inflated out in whatever your IDE is, and it becomes complex. There's trade-offs. So I prefer that methodology. But if you find it more useful to use the that feature-based or that module-based thing, then that's perfectly acceptable. It's just
You just wrap them, if they're making a service, you just wrap the service declaration inside of a self-executing function, and then once that all the code gets concatenated and just run, there's no issues.
well, so the question is, are you saying under the feature base or under the
No, like
under
the way that you do it, like when you're including all the files into.
So the way they get included is, and it'll be too much of a pain to try to bring that up here, is just in the index HTML. You have very little actual real HTML that does anything for the website itself, and then you have a big collection of all the JS files you're including, and so that way they all get added. And the way that they're defined, if you remember, there's an Angular.module, and then you give the name of the module, and then you'd say .factory and the name. And so that is then registering that service factory with the module. So whenever you want it later, it's already there. But it does require you to, at some point you have to have the JavaScript file loaded. You don't need to instantiate the code. That's what Angular is doing for you. Yes.
So you can hook it to existing Twitter Bootstrap. So you keep the Bootstrap structure intact, and you connect Angular. Actually, you point to the JavaScripts in that.
So the question is, as I understand it, basically,
Yes.
that's sane, and actually that Yeoman that I mentioned earlier, Angular generator that they have built is actually an Angular Bootstrap application. So it just hooks in beautifully, because all it ends up doing is just pulling in CSS, and so it's just styling off of your template. I mean, you could not use Bootstrap. I mean, we actually use Foundation at Packback. You could do it completely by hand. This app is completely really, really bad CSS. So you can do it in any number of ways, and it has no impact. Yep, and over there.
What happens when your application? How easy is it to migrate offline? Can Angular handle manual?
I'm sorry, what can I
What
handle?
happens when your application grows?
Okay.
Yeah, so how easy is it to migrate offline?
Migrate in what way? I'm not. What I mean, what would you be migrating to?
So my question is basically, as your application grows, can Angular handle large applications? Because what I got out of this was that it's really good for single page applications. But what happens as you add more features?
No, it scales fairly well. I mean, a lot of it. So the question is, how well does Angular scale? How can you build large scale applications off of it? And I mean, the answer is you can, and a lot of it does depend on you architecting your application properly. One of the big things, when I first was learning Angular, I was actually contracting over at Sears down over on State Street. And the one thing we kept saying over and over and over again to each other was, do this the Angular way. And you laugh, and it sounds funny, but a lot of it is that, it is very easy. We come from other disciplines, or we come from other frameworks. Maybe you can use Angular and jQuery together. You could combine Angular and Bootstrap or Backbone into the same application. It would be kind of nasty, but you could do it. But you start running into situations where you're trying to accomplish something, and what ends up being a shortcut, and it works, but then the problem becomes it doesn't interact with the rest of the system. Or if it does, it requires a lot of kludging, it requires a lot of hacking just to get things to connect up again. But if you make sure that you build things in that Angular way, so you follow the architecture that they've defined as far as using services to do all of your real world work, using their particular services to handle your AJAX calls, even though you're like, oh, I could just use Java, I could just use jQuery's AJAX. But if you use what they are providing you, it makes your system consistent and cleaner. So as it does grow, it still remains manageable. And then if you do get into a migration path where maybe You know, if you're talking about an application getting really, really large, you need to start looking into the fact of, should it still be one single application? And if we go back to that original thing that you can do, Angular has a capability of allowing you to have multiple apps within one system. The best way to describe it, you know, you can have this big tree of web pages and have it be multiple individual apps. That you just have to manually bootstrap it, and you can't nest them. So they all have to be very independent. So you can do that. And that way you can, you know, try to figure out a way to keep your routing very consistent and very clean across them, or however it ends up working for you. But it does provide the capability of doing that. It is not merely here's a quick little CRUD application and then you can't do anything else. I mean, it can handle much more intensive work. It just does require you to build effectively. But even my experience with Ember and Backbone, they do too. I mean, I've worked on some. The Ember I worked on was pretty good. The Backbone I worked on was absolute crap. So it can be, you can build crap in any language or any framework. I mean, I've seen it in many languages, and we've all seen it. And so it's just a matter of make sure you build it right, and Angular will continue to be your friend. Any other questions?
What are the 3 biggest bottlenecks you can see?
Bottlenecks where?
On performance and coding structure, and when you deploy them.
So he's asking 3 biggest bottlenecks. As far as actual coding, it's either maybe not misuse, but incomplete usage of existing constructs. The one thing I was demonstrating or referencing a few times is the ng repeat directive that they have that allows you to take a collection of items and have that build out a whole big grouping of DOM elements. That particular directive has a few very interesting features to it. It has one thing called track by, which allows you to set a unique ID to tell it what is the unique ID for that collection of objects. And so that as you come down, and as long as each one of those is unique, as you add and remove elements from that collection, it won't just completely blow away and rebuild that entire listing in the DOM and everywhere else. It will be able to be intelligent. It will be able to intelligently go in and pick and choose what it wants to pull out and what it needs to add. So using it effectively, and also you can apply a filter so that you're only utilizing the amount of data that you need. A bottleneck on deployment is not using a good quality build system. Definitely use Grunt, use Gulp, whichever one works for you, whichever one you're comfortable and happy with. They make life so much easier. I remember in my previous life, I was a C++ developer, and I was writing Windows applications. There was no such thing as a clean deployment. I mean, we had so many problems just because there wasn't a particular service pack on a given machine that was trying to build our Visual C++ code. And then someone came along and go, I'm going to make this make file and we'll use MS Build and it'll be great. And it was until he stopped being the guy in charge of it. And then no one knew what the hell he had done. And he was far too busy on other things to really give us a lot of tutorials. So you had a few different people looking at it and causing it problems and so on. So a good solid deployment structure using a preeminent task manager, use one of the big ones. You could possibly find someone, something out there that is like some really off color one, off brand. You're like, oh, this is great. It does this one extra thing that I need, but no one else is using it. So when you run into problems, you can't find any help on it. There's that advantage to sticking to the well-used stuff. I mean, those are the 2 main things. And obviously, be careful about what you're, if you do end up using a package manager like Bower or NPM, be careful about what you bring in. Don't just bring in everything under the sun. It's like, oh, this would be neat, this would be neat, this would be neat. Fine if you want to try them, but make sure you clean them up later. Because all of a sudden, you're not paying attention, and then your deployment, even if you are using Grunt or Gulp, is taking 15 or 20 minutes just to download all your Bower components, because you decided at one point, I'm going to go look to find the best possible slider control available. which, as we all know, is Angular custom range slider. That's the name of it? Yeah, that's my Bower component. So just it's a lot of it is being cautious with your own code, taking responsibility for what you're building and what you're putting out into your source control system. That even though we have all these great tools that make things easier, those same tool, as the expression goes, a gun is a great tool until you turn it on yourself. So it's got a little dark. All right, so but that's the basic things you have to watch for. Any other questions or off-color comments that will elicit groans?
All right, thank you.
All right, thank you.
All right, next month's meetup will be on an unusual date. We actually have to adjust it because of travel plans and things. But keep an eye out for that. It will probably not be on a Tuesday.